I actually, to put it bluntly, I think public transport is a public good. And if it's a public good, it's best handled by a public institution using public revenues so that you take care of it for the long term. And as you know, one reason why I may get in trouble for saying this, but one reason why the SMRT had problems is because when you're a private institution, your main focus is on your next quarterly results 3 months from now. So if you want to focus on your next quarterly results 3 months from now and you want to make sure that your profits look good, the easiest thing to cut is maintenance. Because if you cut maintenance, the costs of cutting the maintenance will be felt 10 years later. It won't be felt right away, but your quarterly results will look good. And you saw, I mean, sadly enough, I can tell you that when the Singapore's MRT system was launched, one of the greatest admirers in the world of the Singapore MRT system was the United States ambassador to the UN called General Vernon Walters, Dick Walters, who became a good friend of mine. And his hobby was visiting subway stations around the world. Seriously, Moscow, Paris, London, everywhere. And he said, Kishore, this is in the 80s, he said, the best subway system in the world in the 1980s, he said, was Singapore. He says, you are the only country that actually built an underground railway system ahead of schedule, below cost, and so clean and functioning so well. So we were #1 in the world in the 1980s. And then now you look at the newspapers, every other day there's something breaking down. Clearly, when something breaks down today, it's a result of a decision made 10 years ago. So that shows the consequences of focusing on quarterly results rather than long-term institutional strength when it comes to delivering public goods. But I think, to be fair, I think at the same time there has been, as I say, a reversion to the norm, and so now more and more investment is made in our underground system as a public good, and that's happening. Anyway, so you have this rather unusual situation, which I'm surprised people accept here, which is that you have a private company running the bus system, but you have the government giving buses to a private company to run buses, which is rather unusual. It's a new model that I think other countries will be puzzled by. But anyway, so that's my answer to your question. So shall we have questions on the floor? Narayan is a good friend. He's, by the way, as Tomiko would say, he's the right Sindhi. He made the right decision. He didn't study philosophy, he went to business.
Kishore, just to take up the point that Tommy made about him being more optimistic about Singapore's future, you were a little more downbeat about it. The Americans say after 200 odd years that they are still an exceptional society. So if that is the case, and if you buy into that, under what circumstances do you think that Singapore can continue to be an exceptional state or society going forward the next 50 or 100 years?
Yeah. Okay, great question. Let me begin by saying that I'm not pessimistic. I'm just slightly less optimistic than Tommy. And I frankly think that, I agree that the United States has been an exceptional country, absolutely no doubt whatsoever. There's no country since human history began that has been as successful as the United States in terms of its manifold achievements and so on and so forth. But you can do that when you're a big, large country and you can attract the best and brightest to come to your country, okay? So if you go to Silicon Valley and you see that, if you go to anywhere, there's startups, half the room is full of Chinese and Indians, And if you try and get venture capital money, they will say, what's your IC factor? How many Indians and Chinese do you have in your team? No Indians, no Chinese, no venture capital. So that's what America can do. But you can see in Singapore, clearly Singapore can and should do what America is doing, attract the best and brightest. But you saw in the last elections, the backlash against too many foreigners coming in. So, and we don't have the scale of land, we don't have the size of the United States of America. We actually, we are physically the most constrained country in the entire world. And sometimes when I speak to audiences overseas, I say, I'm sure you've all seen a map of Southeast Asia. In the map of Southeast Asia, there's one island called Sumatra. On that island called Sumatra, there's one volcanic mountain. On that volcanic mountain, there's a small lake. In the middle of the small lake is a small island. And that small island is bigger than Singapore. I mean, that's how small we are. Okay? Now, with that kind of physical constraint, it takes exceptional leadership to produce the kind of value add that Singapore has done the last 50 years. Now, exceptional leadership is very difficult to produce. Very difficult. It is in fact, if you look around the world today, what is actually quite striking is globally there's a shortage of exceptional leaders around the world. So that, how is it a small country like Singapore can beat the odds and continue to produce exceptional leaders? So maybe Tommy has an answer to that.
Yeah. I think size is not destiny. Yeah? Size is not destiny. Size is not destiny, especially in this new world, which is relatively borderless. And if you do not have enough physical land within your national boundaries, you can actually borrow another country's land. As Singapore has done, we built new towns, industrial estates in China, in Vietnam, and many other countries. If you don't have enough people, you can attract talented people to join you, or you can outsource your enterprises to other countries. In this new world, sure, the size of your country is a constraint, but it doesn't determine your destiny. Singapore is, after all, one of the world's largest trading entities. You know, no reason why we are, but we are. We host one of the world's largest seaports, airports, telecommunication center. So my point is that we have many constraints, but with good leadership, outstanding human capital, good governance, and our multiculturalism, and the livability of our city, which is so exceptional in Asia, I think we can continue to be successful.
My question is on India. You mentioned that Singapore will have to make some hard choices in the next 50 years to decide between US and China and how to balance that. What role do you think India will play in Singapore's survival in the next 50 years? And this year being Singapore-India 50th anniversary, can you project what it will look like in the next 50 years?
Yeah. Well, let me take a stab at answering the question, and Tommy can add something, because I think he's a chairman of the Singapore-India dialogue that we have. Well, I think India's role in Southeast Asia is going to grow by leaps and bounds. And again, it's perfectly natural. It's a natural consequence of India becoming bigger and stronger. And also, if you look at the larger history of Southeast Asia over the last 3,000 years, out of the 10 member states of ASEAN, 9 have what they call a Hinduized cultural base. Only Vietnam has a Sinic cultural base. Well, that shows you that the influence of India in Southeast Asia goes back thousands and thousands of years. And it's still see, I mean, if you travel around in Indonesia or Thailand, you can see the Ramayana and Mahabharata being performed and so on and so forth. So those are very deep links that were cut off, as you know, when the British and European colonizers came. So the natural symbiotic links within Southeast Asia and India were cut, and they'll be restored. So, and also quite naturally, as China becomes more and more powerful, it's natural for small states, medium states to hedge their bets. And the way they hedge their bets is they develop relations with other powers, with the United States, India, and so on and so forth. So I have no doubt that India's role in this region will grow. But India's challenge is that at the same time that India can never deliver the same kind of goods that China can deliver to Southeast Asia. I mean, I give you look for example what's happening with the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank. China can say, okay, I'll put down $50 billion. There are very few states in the world that can put down $50 billion immediately for a bank. That's an example. So while India's role will grow, it will be very difficult for India to catch up with where China is.
I want to begin by saying that I'm an honorary Indian.
Should I say I'm an honorary Chinese then?
Yes. I think I have. I think I have more faith in India than most Indians do. Yeah, and I take a very long view of India's prospects. And I recall that 300 years ago, the two largest economies in the world were China and India. I also want to recall that these are two countries which are blessed with very ancient and rich civilizations. So I'm optimistic about India's future. I know that from time to time India stumbles, loses its way, but it always gets back on track. And Singapore is heavily invested in India, not only economically, but also politically. I don't know if you know, Singapore is the largest investor in India. Yeah?
Number one.
Number one, yeah. We are number one in both in India and in China. In the last 2 years, we have surpassed Japan as the biggest foreign investor in China. We are also the biggest foreign investor in India. But
that's because of Satpal Kata.
But unlike Kishore, I believe that the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, is a transformational leader. I think under his leadership, India has an opportunity to accelerate its growth. And I will not be surprised if in the next 10 years, India's growth rate surpasses that of China. Yeah? I think it's possible. And Singapore's long-term view of the region is we want to be as close to China as we are to India. We want to be as close to China as we are to Japan. And we want to be as close to America as to these three Asian giants. But most of all, we are anchored in ASEAN. We have a vested interest to keep Southeast Asia peaceful and cooperative. And Kishore and I are both true believers in the usefulness of ASEAN to the region and to Singapore.
Okay. One question over there, then Farish, and then Zainal. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Chinta,
Professor Mahbubani and Professor Koh. Professor Mahbubani earlier in the opening remarks said that Singapore in the first 50 years has been an exceptional state. And in the next 50 years, who knows, maybe yes, maybe not. Given that, and given that it sounds, I haven't read the book, but it sounds like you have sounded caution in the complacency that success has brought to Singapore. I wonder what you think of Singapore's role as an aspiration and a role model for public administration and the governance for countries in the region. We all know that countries like China has sent their government officials to institutions like LKY School and NTU to be trained to learn the Singapore way. Do you think that in the future, Singapore will continue to be an attractive place for upcoming public policy makers from countries like China or Myanmar or Indonesia, Malaysia, wherever, to kind of come and learn the proper way to do things? Thank you.
I'd like to go back to the point that you raised earlier, but also Tommy. First of all, the point about having faith in ASEAN. But the backlash that Kishore mentioned earlier, that we saw at the last election, I think this is not unique to Singapore. We are seeing it across Southeast Asia. And I question why there is this disconnect. On the one hand, the perception that, for instance, foreigners are taking jobs, but at the same time, in many of these societies in ASEAN, there is a lack of awareness that countries are also investing. The same countries actually investing in other countries. So on the one hand, there's a perception in Singapore that among the popular voters that there is an influx of foreign workers, but there isn't the same awareness that in other neighboring countries in ASEAN there is a perception that perhaps capital investment from Singapore can be seen as predatory. I'm worried about this across Southeast Asia at the moment.
Capital investment from Singapore can be seen as predatory.
Can be seen as predatory. I'm worried about this at the moment because looking at the state of ASEAN right now, the democracy that we see across our region tends to be of a populist nature. And I appreciate Kishore's point earlier about exceptional leadership and the need for strong, pragmatic leadership. I'm not sure whether you've actually answered the question, Kishore. I mean, how do you reconcile these two? I think it's difficult to roll back democratization in Southeast Asia. But on the other hand, we are witnessing the rise of, I think, dangerous populist politics in our part of the world as well. And this, for me, is something that jeopardizes the ASEAN project. Because like you, I'm a firm believer in ASEAN, but we do not have a strong enough sense of a common ASEAN identity. We don't see ASEAN as our common home for all ASEAN citizens. So how do we get around this after so many years of ASEAN being around? As we know, in many parts of Southeast Asia, your ordinary Southeast Asian citizen does not feel like an ASEAN citizen. And that will always open the way for reactionary, populist, majoritarian sentiments, especially in the democratic space.
Just to complete the picture, I have an honorary Malay. I'm also honored to be a member of your editorial team when you wrote that article, Question of Decorum. My question is about between exceptional and normal. In fact, I am more inclined to agree with Professor Tommy Koh because I thought we are going into a new normal as what this present phase is all about. Because we've been exceptional, but a new normal in the sense that things are changing, maybe for the worst, but we look forward to new peaks. But in that context, how do you see this danger of the SMRT phenomena creeping into politics and governance too? Whether governments will then resort to the short term, not quarterly, but maybe once in 4 years kind of report card and play to the gallery and be populist. So will that be the real danger to making us really remaining as normal? And a quick second question, Professor, your 4 factors you mentioned just now, would you see multiracialism as the weakest link, or is it a point of strength? Thank you.
You want to go first?
You go first.
I'll go first, okay. Thank you. He's being very generous. Okay, the first question is very easy to answer. I think the Singapore's track record in public administration, delivering of public goods is absolutely exceptional, by any global standards. I mean, I can say that as a dean of a school of public policy, I talk to my fellow deans of school of public policy, and they will be among the ones who say that the standards of governance that Singapore has achieved, I mean, whether it's in building the world's best airport, the world's best port, the best public housing program, and so on and so forth, the best education system, healthcare system that at 4% of GNP delivers better results than the United States at 80% of GNP. So all these amazing things that Singapore has done, they continue to provide role models for the rest of the world. And therefore, in that sense, I can tell you that the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy is in the sunrise industry. So we see no danger to our business in this for a long time. Your question, Farish, is very difficult on ASEAN. And by the way, for your information, my next book, in some ways I share your worry about ASEAN. I feel that many people, not just in Singapore, but in Southeast Asia, are taking ASEAN success for granted. They don't realize how much time and effort was put in by the founding fathers of ASEAN into delivering what we have today. And if we don't nurture it and develop it, ASEAN, like any other organism, can die if we don't take care of it. So that's why my next book will be on ASEAN. The good news is that out of 80,000 words, I've written 30,000 already, so I only have 50,000 more to go. But I actually believe that this is a time for leadership to emerge in ASEAN, and actually genuinely I'm worried, I mean, I was actually very hopeful that President Jokowi would provide fresh new leadership for Indonesia. In many ways he is. but I don't think he shares the same degree of commitment to ASEAN that I think his predecessor did, or in fact many of his predecessors did. And I think it's important to convince President Jokowi that for Indonesia's future, long-term future, Indonesia will be better off with a stronger ASEAN rather than weaker ASEAN. I mean, I can make the case very strongly, but I don't know whether anybody is making the case to him in that regard. Now, finally, on Zainal, your question about exceptional, new normal, and so on and so forth. It is a fact that governments all over the world have to deal with populist pressures. You know, you can't deny it. You have to. It's a new challenge, a new political reality. You cannot go back to the quote-unquote good old days when you could just decide and people would just follow you. No, you got to handle. It's a different political environment, and social media, as we all know, has aggravated it, and so made it. Governance has become much more difficult today in any society. By the way, including in China also. Even in China, the Chinese government has to worry about what the social media is saying and so on and so forth. So in the old days, if Deng Xiaoping decided to make unilateral border concessions to Russia, he could do so. Today, President Xi Jinping wants to make unilateral border concessions, he better be careful. You got to watch what the social media may say. So it's a different world. And Singapore is also not immune from that pressures. And on multiracialism, I see that as one of Singapore's greatest strengths. I mean, I belong not just to a minority. I belong to a minority within a minority. You know, there are, what 6% of Singapore's population is Indians, right? And out of the 6%, I think there are about 10,000 to 20,000 Sindhis in Singapore. Huh? Less. 3,000 Sindhis in Singapore. So,
6,000.
Yeah, so it's tiny. So I belong to a tiny minority within a minority in Singapore. So for someone who comes from a tiny minority within a minority to represent the country as ambassador to the UN is amazing. No other country in the world, frankly, very few other countries in the world would select someone who belongs to a minority within a minority to be the face of the country at the United Nations. So that's very unusual. So that's clearly a strength that we've developed. But the question whether or not we can maintain it, Tommy Cole will answer.
I want to go back to the first question. My response to the first question is that Singaporeans need to learn to be more humble and modest, and not to...
Very difficult.
Not to... Yeah. In fact, I want to tell you a true story. A couple of years ago, when I was in China, my Chinese host asked whether I would be willing to deliver a public lecture at the Foreign Affairs University, and I said yes. After my lecture, I had a whole sea of hands in asking for a question, and one of the questions is, what can China learn from Singapore in relations with your neighbors? And I did not know in advance that there was media in the room, you know. So I told my Chinese student friends that there's nothing you can learn from Singapore because all our neighbors hate us. And I got thunderous applause. You know? I think the Chinese really loved my answer. So I quickly said, excuse me, since there's media present, maybe I should explain myself. But the point I wanted to make is that some of our neighbors see us as being too boastful and arrogant. So there's a need for Singapore to be humble and modest. I would not say, come to Singapore and learn from our model. We must never say that. We say we want to share our experiences with you. You come and look at us. We are not perfect, but if there's something in our experience that you can learn from, then it is for you to do that. Whether it be good governance, whether it is the relative success in balancing economic growth with protecting the environment, which is a big issue in Asia, whether it be the empowerment of women. I believe one of our greatest success stories in the last 50 years is the empowerment of women. And I think it's such an important a success story to be shared with Asia.
How come we don't have a woman prime minister yet?
It will come. It will come. So that's my reply to the first question. My reply to Farish, no, is that don't be too harsh on ASEAN. You know, first, I don't think democratization is a negative force. I think I welcome the democratization of Southeast Asia. I do not think democratization will inevitably lead to populism or to ultra-nationalism. It is really for the leaders. It is really for the leaders to channel nationalism into the right direction. And if nationalism become ultra-nationalism, inward-looking, seeing the world outside as a threat, it's a failure of leadership. So I welcome democratization, and I think nationalism can be both a positive and a negative force. As for your sense that we don't have this common identity as members of the same family, I would say that at the highest level we do. At the level of policy makers, political leaders, civil servants, we have a clear sense of belonging to the same family. It will take time for this sense of common identity to filter down to the rakyat. So evolving a common ASEAN identity is a work in progress, you know. But we are only 48 years old, and if you think back to 1967, when we began, the prospects were not promising because we had been ruled by different colonial masters. We may be neighbors, but we were not knowledgeable about each other. And it's taken us many years to find out about each other, to learn about our different cultures, to evolve common values. I think we've come a long way, actually. I'm very optimistic about the future. And I agree with Kishore's reply to Zainul. I think multiculturalism is one of our most important achievements. When we look at the world today, where there's so much disharmony between people of different religions, not just in the developing world, but also in the developed world, when we see so much trouble between people of different ethnic groups and different tribes, even in America, which I know so well, the fight against racism in America is not over. You know, the fact that so many black men and black boys, unarmed, have in recent years been killed by the police is a symptom that that fight is not over. You know, we don't have that kind of racism here. Tribalism is an evil that haunts so many countries in the world. And I just want to tell you a story that you may not know, that tribalism at one time haunted Singapore. Relations between different Chinese clans are so good today that you'll be shocked when I tell you that the worst riot in Singapore's history was one between the Hokkiens and the Teochews. Yeah. In 1854, there was a riot between the Hokkiens and Teochews that lasted 10 days, and 600 people were killed, you know. So tribalism within a race can be a great evil, you know. And we've seen this in many parts of the world, especially in Africa. So I would say our achievements of inter-religious harmony, our achievements of interracial harmony, our achievements of inter-tribal harmony is a great achievement. And we must preserve this because it's really a great comparative advantage.
I'm both optimistic as well as a little bit skeptical, and I have a question really to build on where you were at earlier, Kishore, on your point of exceptional leadership. So I'm optimistic in the short term, but perhaps not for the reasons that I've heard so far. And I think we have a little bit of tailwind advantage that I see in my firm a lot of facts around. So while I don't think, by the way, that Singapore has become particularly complacent, when I travel around in the region and around the world, I see more self-questioning going on in Singapore than I see in many places. That makes me very, very confident for our future. If we're willing to put our problems on the table, we're more likely to be able to solve them. And I do think some of the structural advantages that you talked about governance, institution building, are very strong. And in a world which is urbanizing very rapidly, we're going to benefit from them for the next 5 years or so. So in fact, I'm worried about too much complacency creeping in the future. It isn't around today. What I worry about is the type of leadership. This isn't just about how much leadership, but about what kind. Because the things that made us successful so far, in McKinsey we talk about how we've created value in places like Singapore through mostly facilitative leadership. The forces at work are already there, and you rearrange them to create value for this little hub, as opposed to creative leadership, where you come up with new products, new ideas, and you generate value from them. This is a different DNA, a different muscle, and I don't see enough of it here. So in my conversations that I have with the CEOs here, I see, constant devolving to the norm, and a lot of risk aversion, which is a little bit debilitating. And we wonder, how do you stoke, risk-taking, more permission for people to be able to swing for the fences. And I don't know if you've seen examples of where that has already happened, or how you might get that going.
Well, let me say very quickly, I'm more pessimistic than both Tommy and Kishore. Kishore has chosen a very provocative title for his book, Can Singapore Survive? And when I heard this, or read this, my first thought was, can we survive environmentally? So I won't go into details, but I think our environmental challenges are huge. And as Mr. Lee Kuan Yew has said, well, Kishore, you said this is the century of Asia, but Mr. Lee has said very correctly that this is the millennium of environmental challenges. So I can't resist, since you get two in one with these, and of course Professor Koh is Singapore's best known environmentalist. So I would have liked to hear you say, Professor Koh, as one of our strengths, that we have environmental sustainability, we have livability. Livability does not equate environmental sustainability, as we know. So could you please reassure me on this, like you reassured everyone else?
Hi, we have two brilliant minds, and thank you very much for sharing, the same and different perspective. I've been involved in ASEAN as the president of Business ASEAN Forum, and it's taken us this long to get together as one, but certainly a lot of differences, especially when there are changes in terms of the political arena, whether it's Malaysia or Indonesia, where we're more involved in, or even Thailand. But my real question is, and my concern is about Singapore moving forward, is that there's no longer the top-down acceptance that we have been ingrained and accepted until now. I'm very happy to sense that our current team has been able to diversify very quickly to be part of an inclusive society, to bring the younger people in. The question is, there's always problems with the middle age, or people like our pioneer group, that seems to be very dissatisfied, and we have to continuously find a way to help these people. How do you see the current political changes within, in 2 years? Because that is really my concern, because there's so much unhappiness, yet the government has done so much to incorporate everything for us, and if they're still unhappy, how can we make everyone happy? And to make sure that Singapore can move forward. Thank you.
So, shall I go first?
You go first. Yeah.
Thank you. Chita, your question is actually a very, very important one. I mean, you're saying, yes, let's not worry the next 5 years. Let's worry about what comes after that. But there's also a danger in thinking, no, we have enough to keep going. Because the question is about who should worry, okay? I think it's very clear that the government is worried, okay? I mean, the Prime Minister has said so many times now, it's one of his favorite expressions that only the paranoid survive. He quotes Andy Grove of Intel, I think, who says that. So, and I think the Prime Minister is right. It's his responsibility to be paranoid about the future of Singapore. But I think that paranoia is not shared by the population at large, and certainly now less and less shared by even some members of the establishment, And so that's a challenge, you know. And I think for a small state like Singapore, because the odds of history are against the survival of small states, you really got to work extra hard to survive. And so you always got to be paranoid. And I'm not so sure whether the people are ready for that. And so the question is, how do you... And by the way, you know, the difficulty about paranoia is that it can be psychologically destructive. As you know, paranoia is a psychologically destructive sentiment. To be able to function well, to be confident, motivated, and succeed while being paranoid is actually a very difficult thing to do emotionally. So that's a challenge that Singapore faces. So you're saying that so far you only have to do facilitative leadership, not creative leadership in Singapore. I actually think that for the next 50 years, we will again need a new round of creative leadership in Singapore, because many of the old formulas cannot work. The formulas that work in the first 50 years cannot work in the next 50 years. You know, that's what happened to Kodak. Kodak assumed that the formulas of the last 50 years would work in the next 50 years, and it cannot. So to avoid that Kodak moment, which Tommy mentioned, which I speak about in my book, you have to have continuous creative leadership. And that's an existential challenge for Singapore. Now, Gaming, your point about environment is well taken. You're right. I think that's a big dimension about Singapore's environment you've got to pay attention to. But the sad part about Singapore is that being so small, even if we kept our environment completely clean, all you need is a forest fire in Sumatra or a petroleum refinery in Johor, and we'll be in trouble. So clearly, if we want to take care of our environment, we must develop very good relations with our neighbors, and so that both of us have mutual sensitivity. And that's also not easy to achieve. And finally, about the, you mentioned about the pioneer group, Jenny, I'm so glad you mentioned that. I'm very happy to inform you that with my pioneer card, I'm going to show it to all you, I'm a very happy man. I'm a beneficiary of this pioneer group. But it's actually a very wise move, I think, on the part of the government to take care of a generation. I mean, I'm lucky, I did very well, okay? I mean, I've done, as Tommy mentioned, I've done very, very well. But you know, in the street that I grew up in, the 4 or 5 houses on my left, 2 or 3 houses on my right, no one ever went to university. I was the only one in the whole stretch, you know. So can you imagine where they are now? One of them is, I still see him, he's a bell captain in Hilton Hotel, you know, one of them is a driver. These are the people whom I grew up with. So for that, people like that who are bell captains and drivers, this pioneer card means a lot, you know. It's a big deal. So I'm really glad that the government has done it. So I'm not so worried in the short term. Again, politically, I'm prepared to take bets with any of you that PAP is going to win the next election. Right? Anybody wants to bet? But the next election after that, you begin to wonder what's going to happen. You know, natural. So, these are the new political winds that are coming. The thing to emphasize here is that the new political winds in Singapore are the same political winds in many other countries. So this is what I call the normal situation. You will have new political challenges. So you then have to develop the instincts, you know, the intuition, the reflexes to handle these new political challenges. You have to, because they're coming. And I think, as I said, I'm not worried about the next elections, but after that, privately, I talked to many of you, I'd spoken to many of you at dinners, and you'll tell me, yeah, you're over it. So that's a new situation in Singapore.
I'd like to ask a question about censorship in the arts.
Robert, you better tell them you taught me poetry in school, no?
Yeah, but I don't know, Kishore, whether you have written anything about censorship of the arts, and because Tommy Koh is the first chairman of the National Arts Council. But I'm concerned about things like the disallowing of films by Tan Pin Pin about political exiles,
the controversy about withdrawal of books by the library, and of course things like Ken Kwek's films running into problems. I just wondered whether or not you think that Singapore authorities have got censorship right, censorship of the arts. I might cite a personal problem that I encountered, and I think I might have referred to Tommy Koh the fact that some years ago I wrote the libretto for an opera called Fences. It was a kind of Romeo and Juliet story set around the time when Singapore was going to enter Malaysia. Well, to cut a long story short, the NEC did not give me funds, and I think that's a form of censorship. And the reason was that I took a very dim view of Singapore's multiracial situation and its religion, which I did not. So I'm concerned about these problems, and I wondered whether both of you could address these things. Thank you.
Tommy, you answer the question.
So there are 4 questions. 1 minute for each question. The first question, I would say I don't share your impression. I think there's a new spirit of entrepreneurship in Singapore. I see this among both my sons and among their friends, most of whom are in the private sector. Many of whom have started their own businesses. Singapore has one of the most conducive environment for startups. So I'm very optimistic. The second question by Dr. Gay Min. We are very small and very urbanized, but we have 2 very precious achievements. We have shown the rest of the developing world that it is possible to make the transition from an underdeveloped to a developed economy without ruining your environment, without polluting your air, polluting your water, And much more than that, in recent years, Singapore has pioneered the view that urbanization and cities are not the enemy of nature. We have mobilized a group of like-minded cities to share with us the view that cities are important agents for conserving biodiversity. And in fact, the UN has adopted a Singapore Index of Biodiversity for cities. Jenny Chan's question. Singapore has changed, I would say Singapore has changed for the better. The old way of governing Singapore from the top down is no longer viable. And this is true not just in Singapore, but all over the world. So the new normal is a much more inclusive, consultative process. But look at the recent budget debate in Parliament. Isn't it wonderful that the governing party and the opposition were in agreement that this is a good budget, And if Singaporeans are unhappy, it is because there are some good reasons to be unhappy about. I think we have allowed the inequality of wealth and income to grow too wide. I think in recent years we were not careful in calibrating how many foreigners we can absorb without upsetting Singaporeans. Singaporeans are basically welcoming of foreigners. We're not xenophobic, In fact, I always make the argument that we are one of the least xenophobic people in the world, And about the future, I'm very optimistic. I think the new budget is a wonderful budget. As someone who will have to pay 2% more for my tax, I welcome this.
Why you earn so much money?
I don't resent this at all. I welcome this. I'm happy to pay 2% more in order that I can help the elderly poor in Singapore who have made many sacrifices for our country and have a right to live in dignity in the closing years. And I also welcome the skill development initiative, Skills Future. Why? Our ambition is to retain a manufacturing sector as a major pillar of the Singapore economy. This is very hard to do. If we want to keep manufacturing at 20% of the economy, the secret of failure or success is skills development. There are 2 countries in the world that we wish to emulate, and these are Switzerland and Germany. And what the government has done in promoting technical and vocational education, apprenticeship, putting money where our mouth is the right thing to do. It ensures our continued success. It ensures that people who may not be academic